All right, good evening, everyone. We are going to get started, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Toronto. My name is Marianne Hatzopoulou. I'm a professor in civil engineering here at U of T. I also founded the Positive Zero Transport Futures think tank. It's sort of this institute slash policy think tank at U of T where we really deal with questions of implementations, innovations that aim to decarbonize transportation and how they work out in the real world. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It's my great pleasure to host this panel and seminar series today. And today I want to make it more about children's health, right? I don't want us to just be talking about technology or technology transition. I think we think about children's health in terms of nutrition. We think about providing safe play spaces for them. Recently, we started becoming really aware of, the school environments and air purifiers and the indoor environments in which we operate, but I still think we haven't yet made the connection to transportation, right? How they get to school, how they come back home from school, and what part of that plays to the overall, health and holistic well-being of our children. And I think that's a very, very key point that one of our speakers today, Dr. Sarah Adar, will be touching upon. But, electrifying is easier said than done. I do a lot of work that involves simulation, and all we turn off diesel emissions in our model and we say, hey, there are great benefits associated with that. But the real world is really messy. It entails thinking about charging, thinking about range, thinking about performance, the logistic challenges that are associated with, electrifying fleets. And Sue Gander is going to be talking about all of these real world challenges with really piloting and implementing transitions in electric school buses. And I think hopefully we all agree that this is just beyond just us. This is a matter of funding, of infrastructure, of pilot testing, and of rallying stakeholders and policymakers around this very important topic. And hopefully we'll have great panel discussions with a broad range of panelists. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sue, who's going to be our first speaker today. Sue is currently the director of the Electric School Bus Initiative at the World Resources Institute. In a few words, she's basically in charge of electrifying the US fleet of 480,000 school buses by 2030. Prior to WRI, she was the managing director of policy for the Electrification Coalition, where she worked to accelerate the adoption of EVs at scale. So Sue has long legacy in understanding electrification in the transportation context. She also served at the EPA and the Center for Clean Air Policy, where she led initiatives on clean energy, air quality, and climate change. She rides an e-bike, another wonderful form of electric transportation. So Sue, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm not in charge of everything, just want to make that clear. But it's great to be with you. Folks hear me okay? All right, awesome. I've never been accused of having a soft voice. It got me in a lot of trouble growing up. I was always the one that, got blamed for things just because I was the loudest. But it's great to be with you here. It's my first trip to Toronto ever. I've been to Canada many, many times, but I've been enjoying it. I already got a chance to meet with some local EV entrepreneurs and companies at Switch and at Flow. I got to eat some really good dumplings. Oh, that was a plus. And just enjoying the time here thus far. And this is definitely a highlight, obviously, the reason I'm here. But I'm going to mainly share with you what we've been learning over the last few years, about 3 years now that we've been working on an electric school bus initiative through the World Resources Institute, and talk to you about what we've learned and how we think it might be applicable to the work that is already going on, but hopefully going on more so in Ontario. I want to say thank you definitely to the University of Toronto for sponsoring this. I guess both Positive Zero Transportation Futures and the Mobility Network. It's great to have this conversation, to be able to come, and I'm here also to learn, because there's so much to be learned, and so many things that we need to tackle together in this journey for sure. So I'm going to be hoping to take away a bit. When we first started our work, I will say we did look northward to Canada, because we knew there were already a fair number of school buses in place in some of the other provinces. And we also started working with the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance. There's a couple folks here today from there. I know I already met Nicole in person, but Valerie's here as well. So this is fun for me to see people I've been seeing on Zoom for 2 years. We also work closely with manufacturers, including Lion, who has a broad North America presence, and some of the contractors that are active. So there's a lot of cross-border activity already going on. So I just wanted to make a note of that. And we did do a case study of PEI for their work in electrification. So familiar with some of that work that's going on, and have a few different research projects going on as well, with some Canadian researchers, and maybe some additional research we might do, having heard a chance to learn about that. So that was my little intro, just to kind of let you know where I'm coming from on this. I will be jumping into my slides. I'm going to be starting my timer, but maybe you can give me a little signal when I've got like 3 minutes left, and I'll know I can speak more quickly from there. I have to share this disclaimer about the photos we use. We're not endorsing any particular brand. So you heard a little bit maybe about WRI. We are a global research think tank. We do have a fair amount of advocacy that we're doing in the project I work on, but we really draw from many 40 years of work across the globe in trying to advance solutions for people, planet, and nature. This electric school bus initiative was started really just over 3 years ago, so pretty new to that. Certainly building upon the work of many others that had been working in the U.S. on this effort. We are glad to partner with the Bezos Earth Fund, who set us up for a 5-year program to start. We hope to do longer than that, of course. It's going to take us longer. And our mission is to transform the entire school bus fleet. We feel strongly about the opportunity and the urgency of the need to move to electric. And that's 480,000 buses for the U.S. fleet. And a key part of our work that I'll speak to quite a bit is around making this transition equitable, and what it means to help underserved communities who depend upon school buses, at least in the United States, much more than their peers. So a bit on that equity-centered approach, we try to take it in-house, as well as have it be part of the programs and policies that we support. So we have a dedicated equity team that helps guide us. We've developed an equity framework, and we have a whole equity community of practice that we're working on. And I'll share a little bit more about that. A lot of what I'm going to do today is kind of like just popcorn a bunch of stuff, because we have so much to share, and just welcome your follow-up today or in the future. The other piece that defines our project is we've taken this, what we call an ecosystem approach, really trying to look across all the different players and support different players, everything from the school transportation leaders that are within the schools themselves, as well as within the what we call contractors or private sector that provide transportation services, the manufacturers, the utilities that of course play a key role, the policymakers, and then the community groups on the ground as well. And that really drives our orientation on this, and how we set up our work. And a key part of that is through partnerships. I inserted this slide just to give you a sense of like many partners that we've had. I don't know if these would translate over to Canada, but many groups that we work with on the national level, including in the U.S. we have an Alliance for Electric School Buses. That's a consortium of NGO players, but many partners. And then at the state level, for any state that we're working in, we identify a partner on the ground that can really be there, be a trusted resource, and a continuing force within the effort. So that's kind of an example of how we focus our work. And then we have an advisory council that spans, all these different pieces of the ecosystem to really help us, build our work and be effective in that way. So I want to start with a little bit more on why. Marianne mentioned kids, and it doesn't show up here. You'll see a lot of pictures of kids. But there's 20 million children every day in the U.S. that depend upon school buses to get to school. I mean, this is a way that they get to their, get to school, get to education, and get to a better life. And that's really about what this is about, and making a cleaner ride from them, for them. Collectively, the U.S. School bus fleet, if you will, if you put it all together, is the largest public fleet in the U.S. Part of that's because we don't have so many transit buses. I mean, we have some, a lot, and they go longer and farther, each one of them. But this is a big piece of public transportation. So we definitely have a very long list of whys. It includes looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but also air quality, as well as the opportunity to really move an entire sector forward. And we think that's a great opportunity within the school bus fleet. This is a little bit more about the decarbonization opportunity. It's by far not the largest, approach that one might take, but it's still substantial. And we know from, we've been following the news on the Conference of Parties that just wrapped up, we need every single one of these molecules addressed, and so there's a fairly decent amount that can be done through the school bus sector as well. The main issue in terms of health impacts and air quality, you'll hear from Professor Adair shortly, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it is the harm from diesel that has been documented to be a source of asthma, which is one of the leading causes of absenteeism for children. And it's also something that affects children from communities of color more so than their peers. So that's a big concern, along with a host of other respiratory issues that also can have cognitive impacts, and so really get into those education outcomes as well. So concerned about that diesel exhaust, and concerned about how the exhaust, not just from school buses, but from air pollution and on-road transport in general, is distributed inequitably. And that's really because of, in the US at least, and I'll speak for that, the way that a whole, multi-generations of inequitable policies on housing and transportation and education have driven communities to locate in certain areas. So the school buses are kind of over and above on top of that, but you see these disparities in terms of who depends upon the bus and who is therefore exposed to more pollution than their peers. So I'm going to jump to a little bit of a headline, because I thought, well, we can grab you with some really exciting news on what's going on, as of this year in the U.S. This is kind of our slide that combines a number of things. So we now have, because of the investments that have been made to date, around 69,000 children that are riding electric school buses, far short of that 20 million that we need to get to, but really great start. We have close to 6,000 buses that are either on the road or coming soon because they've gotten the funding. They just need to sort of get the bus and get going. We have almost every state, 49, one more to go, plus actually 4 of our 5 territories. So we're very close with all of that. A number of tribal communities and tribal nations as well. One of the reasons for that is that we have, in combination of federal and state funding, some $9 billion that is available. Again, still not enough, but definitely a great start to bridge that gap on the cost differential. I'll speak to that a little bit later. And also important in terms of momentum is that we have now about 30% of the buses in the U.S. are covered by some kind of transition target. I know in Quebec, just learned that there's a 2021 transition target, which is awesome. I think that's the most aggressive one that I've heard of. We have a number of states that have adopted similar targets with a little bit longer timeline, actually. But because of those, we now have about 32% of the fleet that's covered. So that momentum has started, and we're really excited to keep it going. The first electric school buses in the U.S. Started in California, maybe not surprising to all of us. They're definitely at the forefront of many, environmental movements. It was 4 buses in 3 different areas, like within the same month, so we kind of give them all credit. And California remains the leader in the number of school buses within the states. But this is what it looks like in terms of the climb since, 2014 on the left, and then not a lot of movement until you get kind of into that 2010 timeframe where the VW emissions gate scandal happened and poured a bunch of money into states and allowed them to start funding electric school buses. And then the big bump on the right, which is our federal program that's really started to climb. And, these numbers are small. Again, we cut off the graph before you got up to the 480,000 that we need to get to. But some really good momentum. This is what the map looks like, a little bit of a heat map in terms of where the concentration is. Again, you'll see California, but spread out, in many different places. And it's urban, it's rural, it's suburban. They are spread out pretty effectively across those different geographies. So that's important and exciting for us as well. And we're working on that last state, which is, I don't know if people know it, how their U.S. geography is, but it's the big square state in the middle, has a lot of cowboys. It's Wyoming, tell you. I haven't personally visited there to get them, but I will soon be working on that. So I mentioned the big state jump in federal and state funds, and this is just critical. We're at the point where, I'll share later, we don't have equivalent total cost of ownership between a new diesel and a new electric school bus. I mean, it's not there, even though we have a tremendous amount of operational savings. So we need these incentives to try to buy down the initial cost so that we can get this, in place, and then, work to a place where there is cost parity, and, it's more about what you're usually buying for a diesel bus, and you're kind of building that into your budget over time. But really critical, and we just don't have time to wait for that to happen. We, every time a new bus is bought, it's on the road for 15 years, and that's just, not acceptable in terms of what we need to do for children's health and for the planet. So we've been pushing on federal and state funding. This is the big flagship program that's in the United States. It's a $5 billion effort over 5 years. The first $1 billion has gone out the door. Another $500 million is due to be announced beginning of the year, and another $400 million is kind of out for bidding, if you will, application right now. So they're kind of rolling it out as they go, and it's definitely changed the shape of, and that's just the conversation overall. Mostly for buses, but some of the money can go towards infrastructure. Right now, the current amounts for the larger buses is around $395,000 per bus, which is almost enough to cover the cost. It seems like it's not quite enough, but it's very close. And then this is the map that just shows where those electric school bus targets and goals are that get you to the 30% of the fleet. So really important part of moving the market forward as well. Oops, that was an animation there. The other piece that's really important in terms of the funding is how it's not just come one, come all, or one size fits all. A lot of the funding is designed to help those underserved communities who will need more funding support to bring buses into their schools. And so in the federal programs, as well as many of the state programs that are listed there, you do have provisions that have prioritization for different groups. It could be low income, it could be rural. It could be, in some cases, they have some specific disadvantaged communities definitions that are based on race. It's not often the case. Sometimes there's just a proxy with low income. But I will say that it really is that what our research has shown is that race is the #1 determinant of the air quality that a child will face. And so we try to lean in on that because the other proxies don't quite get at that. But what it means is that across race, and for us, it's different categories, and income and air quality. This is PM 2.5, just one measure of air quality. These are really confusing graphs, so I apologize. What they tell you is that compared to what you would see sort of without the policy, the number of school buses that are going to communities that have the highest percentage of low-income students or highest percentage of air quality, disproportionately those buses are going into those communities. So, that's what we've been seeing so far, something that we're tracking, really carefully to see what the impact has been. How am I doing? Okay. Okay. So now we get to some of the challenges. Those were some of the good news stories, mostly good news. But a whole host of challenges. It's changing an entire new approach to transportation. I mean, sure, the bus kind of looks the same. You have to look for the back end and see if you can see a tailpipe to know if it's electric or not. And you don't hear it, of course, as much. But still a whole different type of fueling and refueling, and even in terms of the financing of the buses. And so it's a big challenge for school districts, for operators, and we are there to try to help them work through all of those challenges. There's the upfront costs, of course, that I mentioned. Infrastructure development, I will say, is the number one issue for us in the United States. It's across the board on electric vehicles. Lots of reasons why that if you're working in this space, I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's definitely proving to be a lot more challenging than we had hoped. There's a big learning curve, of course, and then still just educational needs, just a lot of myths, from maybe there was a bus 5 years ago and it didn't go well, which might not have been a good story, but the technology is now third generation, fourth generation, and so some of those myths are hard to escape and break away from. So definitely a lot of work to be done in terms of trying to address all of these different challenges. But we have come up with at least what we think are some possible solutions. So I try to actually make this a little bit of a what can we do kind of slide here, because we do know that there are solutions to addressing the high upfront costs, for example, and of course it's helpful to have the funding and the financing there. Also understanding what the total cost of ownership is. One of the things that we're looking at that has some promise is the opportunity to repower existing diesel buses that are not too old already with electric drivetrains and cut down the cost there. So a bunch of different solutions and working on those. There's a whole host of approaches to addressing the infrastructure challenge. Really, it's about planning and thinking about right-sizing your chargers. Do you really need to go to the high-level, highest maximum power load on those? You've got school buses parked overnight for 8 hours, perhaps longer, and the ability to charge on a lesser power level and avoid a lot of the infrastructure that might be needed, at least for a time, and important ways to work around that. There's a lot of learning, as I mentioned. We've been working with various community colleges across the country to think about what the driver training can look like, in addition to what the OEMs provide, of course, but continuing that training for those drivers, for the maintenance workers as well. Also first responders in terms of, dealing with an electric vehicle, making sure they understand the safety considerations. There's a whole host of myth busting that needs to be done that we've been working on as well. And then the kind of other challenge is really the scaling question, just moving as quickly as we can through this. And that's where we look to different organizations to partner with, utilities who play a really key role. In the United States, there's 16,000 school districts, and the purchasing decisions, except in 2 states, are made at the district level. And that's a lot of decision making and a lot of people that you need to talk to. And so that's, maybe it's more particular to the United States, but that's a lot of scaling that needs to happen. So we're constantly kind of trying to figure out how do we get to that, bigger chunks of players. So with that, I do want to say a little bit more about how we've worked to center equity and what we think is important for that part of the work. With the incentive programs, I talked to this a little bit already, really important to include equity provisions in those and think about how to direct the funding to underserved communities. Similarly, in utility programs, there may not be an awareness that like they also, in driving where the infrastructure goes and driving how the infrastructure is funded, have an opportunity to think about equity provisions. And there's a new report that's coming out on Tuesday with one of the largest, actually US-based utilities on this very topic. So I hope you'll look out for it. With a bit of a roadmap in terms of what that can look like and some of the modeling in terms of the grid impacts that we expect to see. Training and curriculum, I mentioned that already. That's really a piece of bringing workers along in this effort. And then we put a lot of emphasis on community engagement, really making sure that that's not just, kind of check the box exercise, that there is engagement with the community from the beginning of the effort and all along the way. That speaks to some of the partnerships that we've tried to create and some of the work that we do, facilitating school districts as they move through their effort as well. So just, I don't know, some ideas perhaps that might be helpful in terms of the context here. I'll say a little bit about prices because we get this question all the time. They are higher than we'd like, right? We want them to go down. We are predicting that they will go down, but what we did was looked at inflation-adjusted prices for the three leading types models of school buses. So on the left and then on the right compared is sort of the before adjusting for inflation and then after adjusting for inflation, shows 2019 to, okay, this is the view I wanted to share. Taking out the middle years, which we think have some COVID supply chain sort of disturbances there, what you see on the right is that, from 2019 to 2023, you actually have a bit of a decline, more so on the smaller Type A buses, if you're familiar with those, than some of the larger buses, which is encouraging. Still need those prices to be going down. And certainly, when you see a sticker price, you don't always think about, let me adjust this for inflation. And, school budgets don't necessarily increase with inflation either. So sort of a good news, bad news story on that. I did want to share that we have done a fair amount of work on total cost of ownership, including looking at all these different aspects of it that are there in the bullet points, as well as the savings from at least the data that we have to date on fuel and maintenance savings. And we have this documented in a TCO calculator that's on our website that I'll share in a bit. But the sort of the graphical representation of that is in these little bars here, which the main takeaway is that we still do have a higher total cost of ownership for a new electric school bus, but there's this is again in the U.S. lots of funding that's available both through tax credits, which are available to all school districts, as well as different grant programs that might be competitive, and so not everybody can access those. So this just kind of shows the importance and the ability to bring down that total cost of ownership. And we've also, a lot of animation. We've also done that analysis for a case study in New York where you have 5 repowers. There's not a lot of repowers on the road, so there's not a lot of data there. But what we found is that repowers on a per mile basis, you have to take into account how long they're going to last for. But on a per mile basis, they're less than a little bit less than a new electric. And then once you kind of put in some of the incentives, less than a new diesel as well. So, something to be thinking about. I didn't ask you this, Marianne, but is there ability to play a video? Okay. So I wanted to leave you with just 2 things. One is this video that we made on, it may not play, we have a series that looks at equity in the ESB transition. And I may not be able to know how to play it actually, because it might not have gone through. Sorry. You were 1 step ahead of me. It's like a minute, so.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's do that. And yeah, just
Yeah.
we can get you the information
Yeah,
about how
but
to
I just-
access those. Don't worry about it. It's okay. It's okay.
All right. I think it can work if
It's-
we just.
Oh, is it gonna work now? Okay.
Wait a sec. Oh, cannot.
It's all
Okay.
good. I'd much more be interested in your questions, so we can end there and jump in. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Do you have any questions for Sue? Just raise your arm.
How's it going? My name's Matt. I work for the Peel District School Board and
Wonderful.
managing the transportation there. So I just had a quick question. You mentioned there's 6,000 buses that are currently electric in the United States.
Yeah.
And so out of that 6,000, like how many of those folks, the drivers would say particularly park at like their farm or
Ugh,
I don't know,
yeah.
you know, and how are you guys addressing that
Yeah.
issue? You know, is the government, installing the support so they can
Right.
drive that bus every day?
Right.
Question.
I wish I had an answer for that, but we just had a conversation at lunch about this, and I'm hoping you all can figure it out. Um, it's not that high of a percentage of what we call park outs. I've heard on order of like maybe 20%, but you know it kind of really varies by district. You know those are the places that are frankly not going to be where those aren't where those 6,000 buses are going. Because we have not quite figured out what does it look like to support that kind of approach. And my understanding is that that's very common here, at least in Ontario, maybe more broadly. Yeah. Yeah.
Like a lot of the operators, they park at the schools and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So is there any engagement with schools?
Yeah. And some of the school districts in the U.S. do have charging and parking. Their depot will be at the school, and that hasn't been an issue. It's usually they usually like to fence that off. They're very particular, understandably, about keeping their buses separate. But I think it's a real question of like how, what does it mean to fund that infrastructure at somebody's house or a community center or wherever it might be. There's some advantages of having it distributed, across a region and across the grid, but that's a tough one, especially when you talk about like using utility money that's paid by ratepayers to put a charger on somebody's house. We have that a little bit in the light duty space, but I don't know. I'm hoping to come back here in 2 years and find out what you guys have done to solve that. Thank you. Thanks for the hardest question first.
We have a question right here.
Yeah.
We're gonna ask you to hold on for the microphone.
Oh, I can assure you my voice is more than loud enough and I don't need a microphone. Hi, Christopher Ralph from the Line Electric Company.
Oh yeah.
Building on the point from the Peel District School Board,
Yeah.
you mentioned that you'd done some work with Prince Edward Island.
Yeah.
Prince Edward Island has 107 electric school buses, all provided from Lion, and 1/3 of those school buses are in parkouts right now, where the chargers are actually installed in people's driveways across the most rural province in the country. I'm just curious, offhand, would you happen to have any information memorized on how they dealt with parkouts?
So what's interesting about that is that we did our case study before they actually had that in place. So it wasn't, it's not as up to speed, but now that I've heard about this, we're right there. In fact, I might have to visit personally.
You should actually. I'd be happy to set that up.
I feel a need maybe in like May. I don't know. When are the puffins there? Is it puffins?
Wrong province. Puffins. If there's puffins there, it's because Newfoundland sank
Oh
in the
no.
ocean.
Okay. Well, on the way. Okay. Sorry. I hope nobody's here from PEI. They're not offended by.
We'll take the last one.
Hi, my name's Anne Keary. I'm the community co-chair of the TDSB's Environment Committee. And I had a question about another use of electric school buses, and I was wondering if there was any discussion in school districts that you know of using buses and their battery power in cases of emergency, so that they can serve as backup power for schools, as community hubs, as climate emergency centers, basically.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's actually a huge discussion going on that. Some demonstration projects, and I think a lot to be learned. I guess what I'll say is that, there've been testing of the technology, the vehicle to grid or vehicle to building technology in a few different places across the U.S. I was just in Cajon Valley, California, which is near San Diego, or actually right in San Diego, to visit their depot, and they are successfully, operating in that mode, other examples in Massachusetts and New York and so forth. We think there's a great opportunity there. Not everywhere, but where you can marry up, these big batteries on wheels that aren't going to be used, most likely during an emergency because the kids aren't going to school. How do you design into that essentially a vehicle to grid or a microgrid solution? We're part of a funding team that just was awarded to do a project in, two projects, one in California and one in Colorado. We also know that in the United States, there are some 14,000 schools that are already designated as emergency shelters. So people need to come there, or should be directed to come there during an emergency. But if the power's out, that's not really going to help them. So how do we set that up? So it's still early days, and I don't know the experience here in Canada as much, but definitely an opportunity, some things, things to work through, but, a great opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we will have time for more questions during the panel discussion, but it's my pleasure to introduce our second invited speaker. Sarah Adair is an associate professor and associate chair of epidemiology at Michigan School of Public Health, and her research primarily focuses on the health effects of air pollution and noise, with an interest in identifying interventions that reduce exposures and improve health. Sarah has received many awards: the American Heart Association Award for Excellence in Cardiovascular Epidemiology, University of Michigan School of Public Health Excellence Teaching Award, and she was elected to the Executive Council for ISEE, the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology. She is an engineer by training, an MIT engineer by training, and then lost her way into public health at no less than Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So Sarah, please join me.
Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to the organizers of this important meeting for inviting me. It's really fun to be here, not only to show you a bit of our research, but it's really exciting for me to be in the room with so many of you who are really trying to make these changes happen, which is really a joy, and I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you after this during our discussion time. So today, I think that my role in this meeting is really to give you a little bit of a sense in terms of the health and education benefits that we might see among students by replacing older school buses with newer, cleaner options. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We heard really briefly already about the numbers of children who are riding school buses. So I understand actually from the materials starting this meeting, here in Canada, you guys have over 800,000 kids who are riding school buses. And you heard in the United States, we have, around 25 million of our students riding buses to and from school every day. Now, school buses are amazing from a traffic accident perspective, so it's a much safer route to get our kids to and from school. It's also obviously, efficient in terms of having fewer vehicles on the road. But one of the problems we have is that many of our vehicles are really out of date. So I think if I was looking at the right numbers, something like 15% of the US fleet is over 20 years old. So we're talking about these really old buses frequently serving our students. And as you heard in the last presentation, right, it's often these, minoritized community and populations who have the oldest buses. And so that's important because these oldest diesel buses are known to have really high levels of pollution on board. They weren't as subject to many of the stringent standards that we have today, and so the pollution levels inside those buses can be substantially higher than what you'd see in other aspects of their life. So there have been estimates, again, these are for the older buses, but it can be that even those short commutes to and from school contribute like a quarter or more of kids' daily exposures to some of these toxic pollutants. So why do we care? Well, there's a really large body of literature out there demonstrating that traffic-related air pollution is really damaging to our health. So these often have, very small particles, for example, that go deep into our lungs. They can cause damage to the lungs. They can stimulate inflammation throughout our bodies that then can lead to many different health effects. We heard earlier that for children, right, we often think about things like asthma attacks, or we think about, coughs, we think about the ramifications of those things of missing school, and things like that on the daily level. Now, one of the things that's important for us to know about kids is that they breathe in more air per their body size than grown-ups do. Right? So they actually get more of a dose of air pollution if they're standing right next to me, right? The kid is going to have more of a dose. The other thing that I think everybody in this room knows is that kids are still growing and developing, right? And so they're more susceptible to these exposures for that reason as well. And I put up this slide, which is probably one of the more important studies that has come out in the air pollution field in recent past. It's actually published in 2004. But what it's showing you is that so it's not just the short-term exposures to air pollution, okay, you had a high pollution day, so you might have an asthma attack. These repeated exposures actually damage our children's health over the long term. So these are findings from the Children's Health Study out in California, which shows that with higher levels of traffic-related air pollution, so that's that NO2, that's a marker for traffic on the bottom, you actually see that children have slower growth in their lungs, and the elasticity of their lungs is weaker. And what these researchers showed, because they were studying children for quite a long time, is they showed that by the time kids hit 18, there's actually clinical differences in the lungs of children who lived in higher pollution places than lower pollution places, right? So that's a little bit scary. I can see in some of your faces like, oh no, my kids are riding buses, my kids are doing these things. I'm an eternal optimist. So one of the things that I see when I look at this, right, is that there is this nice linearity. There's a dose response. We see that across the board for most pollutants and health effects with air pollution at levels like we see in Canada and the United States. What I see when I look at that is opportunity. Because what it tells me is that if we reduce exposures to our kids, you're going to see measurable impacts in health. So anything that we can do, right, is going to be beneficial and is going to improve the long-term health of our kids. Before I move on to buses, as right, one of the motivating reasons why we're doing all this, I just wanted to follow up that they came back, the Children's Health Study came back years later and looked at the natural declines, or not natural declines, declines because we had policies to regulate air pollution. In the United States, we saw declines in air pollution that you can see on the left. That's for PM 2.5, these fine particles, but you'll also see it for traffic-related pollutants like NO2. And what they saw is that as concentrations came down, indeed you had fewer kids with poor lung function, and that was after adjusting for all kinds of things. So again, it's a message of a positive thing, right? If we can intervene, we hopefully will improve the health of our kids. And that's really why I think, I'm here today. I think it's why it's one of the motivating factors, I hope, for, what all you guys are working so hard to replace, the buses. Now, this meeting is really focused on electric buses makes total sense, right? What that's doing is it's taking the internal combustion engine out of the buses so that you should have lower tailpipe emissions for those kids. That makes total sense. The other thing that I do want to note, because a lot of the research that you'll see here was done before electric buses were really coming online in great numbers, there are ways in which we can also clean up the emissions off of the diesel fleet as well. So there are diesel oxidative catalysts, there's particulate filters, the types of fuel you're burning all can lower emissions off of the tailpipe. And then crankcase ventilation systems. I'm confident many of you guys know this better than I do, but right, this is a system by which you enclose the engine block so as to prevent some of those, emissions coming off of that to come into the bus. So emissions testing shows that those are beneficial. Simulation studies, right, sort of modeling studies all show that those are beneficial. And what we wanted to do in our group was to go out into the real world and look to see if we could get evidence that when you actually implement these, we could see actual improvements in individual children and on school districts levels. So today I'm going to focus on 2 studies for you that we've done in my group. The first one is a prospective cohort study of approximately 300 kids who are in Washington State. In districts where they were replacing the school buses, and we actually have measurements on those kids inside their buses and on their health. And then the last study I'm going to show you is this newer work that we did for the Health Effects Institute that's about the national benefits of a government investment in cleaner school buses. So going into the first study. So this is a study that was actually initiated by Dr. Sally Liu. I always like to put up her photo. And really, she capitalized on an opportunity where Washington State got money in order to replace buses in different school districts. And so she went out and recruited, it was like almost 400 kids from these 2 different large school districts, Seattle and Maple Valley, and was tracking their exposures before and after they implemented this change in their buses, as well as monitoring their health. So what did we find? Well, I guess first off, I should tell you the way in which we were looking at exposures. So you can see in the top picture, that's a little basket of instrumentation that we built and put on board the buses that would ride with these kids to and from school. That sat on 600 rides with kids to and from school. We also had a lead vehicle to try and understand what was really being contributed by the bus as compared to the road around it. So trying to sort of remove out the effects of the surrounding roadway. And what's really exciting, right? Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm sorry. I need to pause for a moment. I could even go back. Oh yeah, up to. One thing I wanted to say, I know this is an electric bus, meeting. I wanted to note that because this research was really done, like I said, before the electric buses really came out in force, what we were looking at largely are comparisons between these old diesel versus new diesel with newer technologies. I know it's not a perfect comparison, but there's some data. There's not a lot of data out there yet really comparing new diesels versus electric with the in-vehicle. But there is a study, we did some pilot work, and there's a study that actually is in Canada from a bunch of your cities, right? And I think what I've concluded from that is A, we need a lot more research to understand it better. I think that's something we need to document. But B, these results should largely be comparable to what you'd expect to see in an electric bus, if not better, right? So hopefully these results are, again, they're really with newer diesel, but they should be relatable to the electric bus experience. So when we compared concentrations of fine particles, which is the PM 2.5, or ultrafine particles, which is that UFP on the bottom, you can see that the switch from older vehicles to newer technologies reduced concentrations that these kids were breathing inside the cabin. Those reductions we saw were sort of on the order of 10 to 50%. So those are some really nice reductions. We also tested the health of nearly 300 kids before and after they made these switches. Here, what I'm showing you is differences in lung inflammation. So really like how irritated the lung is, and it's a comparison, ooh, that was exciting, between, having these technologies versus not. And so what I want to point out is that installing the diesel oxidative catalyst, the crankcase ventilation system, and switching to cleaner fuels resulted in less inflammation in these kids' lungs. And we were able to compare them before and after they switched buses. So it's like not across children, it's actually within the same kids. And what's notable, right, is that this is much more dramatic for kids who have asthma. That's not that surprising, but quite important. And again, right, the communities that are minoritized in the United States often have higher rates of kids with asthma. The other thing that we were interested in, right, is so if kids, especially those with asthma, are having more irritation of their lungs with more pollution, then they're more likely to miss school. Missing school is really problematic because I don't know how many of you guys are parents of young kids or how many of you employ parents of young kids, but when those kids are out of school, right, it's not just that the kids were out of school, the parents have to stay home and there's less productivity and all of that. So we looked at whether or not the switch over to cleaner buses was associated with absenteeism. And indeed, we found that kids were overall 5 and 10% less likely to miss school when they were riding the cleaner buses than when they were riding the dirty buses. And those kids with asthma were like 15 to 20% less likely to miss school when they were on the cleaner buses. So that's a big difference. When we extrapolated those results, to the whole U.S. population based on what we knew of how many kids have asthma and, how many buses are out there, we estimated that the switch to the cleaner fuels and starting to get some of these technologies resulted in 14 million fewer absences per year among kids in the U.S. So that was really important. The next thing I wanted to show you, right, so those results were just for 2 districts in the state of Washington. What we wanted to look at next was whether or not these results held nationally. So in the United States, we heard a little bit about the money that goes into electrification, which is very exciting, and there's a lot out there now. But earlier than that, the EPA started to invest in just buying cleaner diesels. And so they made this program where they invested, I think the years we studied, 2012 through 2017, right? They invested like $27 million in helping school districts to replace their school buses. And what was so crazy exciting about this, and I really give Meredith Petty, my former student and now faculty at University of Michigan, credit for knowing about this because she was a former EPA staffer. They did it by a random lottery. So people applied for the money. Thank you, Sue. So they applied for the money and then they flipped a coin as to who got the funds because they didn't have enough to fund everyone. Now, Sue knows why I'm so excited. Like my little epidemiologist heart is like skipping a beat when I learn this, because one of the criticisms we have in observational epi, right, is, oh, well, the reason you're seeing that there's better health in the districts that change their buses is because those are districts with more money, they're more health conscious. They would have had better health than the districts who didn't change anyways. And here, it was a flip of a coin. So you can't tell me that they were different because it was random assignment. So from like a study design perspective, oh my gosh, this was like, yeah, I still am excited about it just thinking about it. I'm evolved. All right. So anyways, in order to study the impacts of basically, getting that money versus not getting that money to replace your buses, we had to FOIA the EPA, which means we had to ask for their data because data is hard to get. So I'm going to second that bit there. If you guys are out there doing work and you can collect data that scientists can later go and study, you can study, please, please, please do that. We also went and got information about attendance rates from the districts, the departments of education. We got characteristics about the schools to make sure that they weren't different, even though we randomized. And then we got data from the Stanford Educational Data Archive, which is basically standardized testing scores that they've harmonized across the United States. So we can ask, what was the impact of switching buses? So these are the results that we found for attendance, comparing those districts that applied for money and got the money versus those that applied for the money and did not. Overall, we saw kind of a weak impact on attendance. So you saw that the districts that got the money replaced the buses, and we verified that they did that. EPA required that. You were seeing about 6 extra kids in their seats every day at school in a district of about 10,000. It's something, right? But perhaps not quite as large as you might think, but still quite big. What was really interesting to us is that we know that the buses have gotten cleaner. Congratulations to all of you who have worked on that. That's amazing. The buses have gotten a lot cleaner over time, but the oldest buses are still highly polluting. And what we see is that when you look at the impacts on attendance based on the year of buses replaced, if you replace the oldest buses, you are now seeing 45 kids in their seats each day that weren't there before when they didn't have those clean buses, because they were replacing these oldest highly polluting buses. So that's super exciting. When we look at the actual impact of exactly what the EPA did, right? So looking at exactly those districts that were replaced, we estimate that there were 350,000 children more in their seats each year because of that program. If we go and say, hey, what if the EPA could find enough money to replace all of the oldest buses? Or what if we used electric bus money to only replace the oldest buses? We could see 1.3 million children in their seats each year newly because of that replacement. Like, that's a lot of kids in their seats. If you want to think about money, the EPA has given a number for how much it is to have a kid in their seat at school, so attendance. Based on the EPA's investment of $27 million, we estimate that we're seeing $350 million in benefits only because of absenteeism alone, not because of all the other stuff that happens too. And if you could replace all of the pre-2000 buses, we guess that you could see about $1.3 billion of benefit in the United States. So this is no small amount of money. Because we know that kids not in their seats at school, right, are also not learning as much, we also looked at educational attainment. What's interesting here is overall, we don't see a very big impact of switching the buses. But again, if we focus in on those oldest school buses being taken out of commission and replaced with cleaner buses, we do indeed see that those districts were having higher performance on their reading and language arts scores as well as their math scores. So I hope that what you're seeing is, that really replacing buses has measurable impacts that we can see on children's health, their educational performance, their attendance, and that's especially true for asthmatics, and it's especially true if we can replace the oldest of all old buses. That's sort of my, if I had a rallying call, it's like, let's get all those old buses off the road. Lions, you guys want to sell them the new buses. I see eyebrows going up, right? That I think would be really beneficial from our population standpoint. The other thing that I will say again is that we haven't, done any testing in electric vehicles explicitly. I suspect that they'll be similar, but we are proposing to do new research on this. Actually, Meredith Petty, who's again a new faculty member in our department, is currently working on a proposal. We're looking for partners. We're looking for great ideas. If you guys have burning questions that you want us to try and answer in that, or if you have districts that we might be able to help follow or things like that, we would absolutely love to talk to you. I thank our funders, which include the NIEHS and HEI, And if you ever want to talk about the health effects of buses or other things, we certainly appreciate your reaching out to us. Oh yeah, microphone is running towards you.
Hi, Adam Rosenfield. I'm with the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario in our Emerging Technologies Office. Thank you for this talk.
Yeah.
It's interesting hearing the perspective of just how important cleaning up our diesel buses has been. Putting aside all the other benefits of electric buses, but the clean air angle almost makes me scratch my head about how much is it important to just clean up our diesel buses and get the oldest buses off the road versus going full tilt to electric. And one of the reasons I ask about that is because reading some reports with advice for policymakers on this is, this may be a little in the weeds, but one idea was to extend the allowable lifespan of our existing buses for a little bit in the short term to allow some school boards to get their act together with new funding programs that might be coming to then switch to electric. But then that makes me think, oh, we should, that would then leave the oldest buses on the road a little longer to get more gains a bit down the line. So I wonder how do we sort of reconcile the fact that it's about the oldest buses versus just buses in general. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's actually a question that all of us can help contribute to, because as you mentioned, right, it's not just about this. There's also climate change benefit, right? It's a really big issue. To be honest, I can't yet speak to the question of whether or not a clean diesel, like a brand new diesel, would have different answers than an electric bus, and that is something that I would like to pursue. But certainly what I do know with, we're never certain as scientists, but what I feel certain about is that getting the oldest buses off the road is important. Oh yeah, you have a microphone in the back.
Just one comment, I guess, to that one there. The average age in Ontario is 6 years, and the oldest buses are 12 by contract. So I know in the U.S. they have some very, very old buses, but it would be interesting on the new diesel because I don't know many places in Canada where they're running 1999 buses. On average in Ontario, as I said, its average is 6 years and contractually no older than 12.
That's amazing. I'm glad that you guys have a limit, because I was thinking to myself, I don't think we have a limit.
Hi there. I just had a thought about a lot of issues with electrification of school buses here in Ontario is cabin heating. Obviously, it takes a lot to heat up in the cold Canadian climate. So a lot of electric buses are coming equipped with diesel-fired heaters. Has there been any studies on how the emissions from those can impact children's health?
Yeah, so I hear somebody going or I see that in the back. So the question was about, in cold climates, the use of diesel heaters to warm up the electric buses and whether or not there's been any studies on that. I am less aware of any of those. I don't think I know anyone who's done it. We looked a little bit in a pilot study, but it was a very small work and we weren't looking at the health. What I can tell you is I know that diesel is harmful for children, right? I mean, we have lots of literature on that. And the question would just be, how impactful are those heaters inside the bus? And certainly, to the engineers in the room, right, I would just pitch to you, please try and make it so that, those heaters are not impacting the inside of the bus. I mean, if we can do that, right, then all is good.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Bezad. I'm with the Department of Chemical Engineering, working with Professor Greg Evans and Professor Jeff Brook. My question is mostly related to the other side of the coin, if you will. We talked about how great the electric buses are, and we are going through this transition, but the electricity has to come from somewhere, as you may know. So now I'm going to ask you about the 4 states in particular when we look at the gaps. West Virginia, 91%, coal burn, Kentucky, Missouri, and Wyoming, 70%. So now, considering that the health of the children is the priority, And so far, the comparison has been made between the diesel and electrics, and so great the electric is. If I am located in one of those 4 states now, and considering the equity, which is, people of, minority mostly located nearby the power plants,
Yeah.
am I really helping the children by transferring into electricity, or is actually, or have you done any exposure study, with respect to actually comparing burning coal versus diesel?
Yeah. It's a spectacular question, and there is nice research in the past which basically talked exactly about this, that, right, you need clean grid in order to make it truly beneficial. And actually, we've been talking with WRI about trying to do those calculations.
I'm just going to hop in a little bit here. It's a good question. Argonne National Lab in the US has a great tool out that takes the latest data from power plants. It looks at it on a regional power pool, because that's indeed it's not Wyoming power. They're pulling it from surrounding states. You can't necessarily look at it from that perspective, or at least their model doesn't. But if you look at an electric school bus with the current grid compared to a diesel, and they also do a life cycle, including all the on-road and tire emissions and all that other stuff, electric school buses are still cleaner in every situation, and the greenhouse gas emissions. So taking apart another issue, they're twice as clean on that front. I mean, so there are those grid impacts, but they're good now, and they're going to get better as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner. So
Yeah, my counter argument
yeah.
to that would be, having, creating more demand on the grid as dirty as it is. Now we keep talking about Ontario. Ontario is 25 gram per CO2e per 1
Yeah.
kilowatt hours.
Sure, I
Comparing that
understand
to Saskatchewan or Alberta, which is 500
Yeah.
because 95% gas burn.
You're
power.
burning more on the
Yeah.
grid, but if you take into account the exhaust and then you look at the grid, you're looking at that delta there. So I'd love to see what you're looking at too, though. I'd love to take a look at that.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to move straight into our panel discussion and a quick panel presentation. So I'm going to be introducing a number of panelists who are going to provide a 5 to 7 minute presentation, and then we'll have everybody back on stage for a panel discussion. So our first panelist is Christopher Rolfe. Christopher Rolfe is the manager of sustainable mobility solutions with Lion Electric, and he develops energy and infrastructure solutions for the next generation of electric vehicles. He has a decade of experience in the energy solutions in the energy sector, and has worked for companies like Hydro Ottawa, Canada Post, and Brookfield Renewable Energy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Splendid. Show of hands, who here is concerned about anthropogenic climate change? Everyone. Everyone except the chemical engineer, which is usually the case, especially around Sarnia. Everybody here is concerned about children's health. Show of hands. Who cares about kids getting sick? Fantastic. Who here is concerned about heat islands in cities killing people? I'm here to solve all 3 of those things. I am an eternal optimist as well. I am so happy to hear that there are also eternal optimists inside the academic realm. We work in the exact same space. The problem today is diesel school buses, period. Doesn't matter if they were manufactured 6 hours ago, 6 years ago, or 60 years ago. Burning diesel is a problem. COP28 or 29 or whatever, I only remember Rio. It just wrapped up, and we need to eliminate fossil fuels, period. End of statement. There is no discussion around this. It's just whether it's going to occur sooner or later. However, there's also health benefits and health concerns that we should be discussing as well outside of just anthropogenic climate change. School buses represent the epitome of this problem. They idle in schoolyards, which leads to particulate matter concentrations in vulnerable populations. Doesn't matter what race, a child cannot consent. they are a vulnerable population. They do not get to determine where, they don't get to vote on where they go to school, nor do they get to vote on where their bus routes are going to be. They are the most vulnerable population that we have. These routes are central to our population. Anybody here from Ottawa? Anybody here live in Ottawa? Fantastic. Most people, the most dense area of Ottawa is between Heron and Walkley in the area known as Herongate. It is almost entirely immigrants. It has a massive child population, tons of apartment towers, and it has one of the most highest concentrations of particulate matter. This is a problem because that is due almost entirely to bus and trucks. Those routes can be electrified. This is a problem that we created, and it's a problem that we can solve, and we can solve it very quickly. School buses are also incredibly inefficient vehicles. I mean this from a technical and business standpoint. I'm not going to talk about the health benefits. I am not an epidemiologist. I am a climate scientist. I'm going to talk about economics today, and I'm going to talk about climate science. A school bus is very inefficient from a business perspective. It operates between 4 and 6 hours a day. It is idle between 20 and 18 hours a day. In every single one of those hours, it could be doing something and making these companies money. It could be making money for school districts. And lastly, medium heavy duty, or MHDV, has a disproportionate amount of pollution and a disproportionate amount of power inside the sphere, the sector. Sorry, I'm thinking in French and it's trying to come out in English, and it doesn't always work out that way. But it generates more pollution per vehicle than a individual mode of transportation, which can be converted to an electric car or a bicycle or a scooter or any number of other things. Medium heavy duty will largely stay medium heavy duty, at least in the long term, over the next 5 to 10 years. What's the solution? Well, we need to change the methodology of propulsion. There are 2 options to do so. The first is hydrogen, which is not commercially viable today and probably won't be for the next 15 years. I attended a seminar at University of Toronto in 2007 saying it'd be ready in the next decade. I am still waiting, but I hope it will come about at least once in my lifetime. But all the aforementioned problems come from the combustion of fossil fuels, period. There is no argument, there is no discussion, there's no debate. Asthma, particulate matter, all of it stems from the combustion of fossil fuels. We are all in agreement on that. The solution is to move to a new methodology of propulsion. Electricity is the best source because we have complete control over it. We saw a question today about, well, what if the grid is dirty? We can change that. I have a wind turbine tattooed on my arm. This is what I did. We can change that very quickly. And most importantly, the school buses themselves are roving batteries. They can contribute to a cleaner grid through vehicle-to-grid. And they're not just vehicles. This is what I mean by making an inefficient vehicle efficient. By leaving that vehicle plugged in 24 hours a day or anytime it's not on the road delivering children, it can serve as a stationary battery, which opens up new revenue opportunities for those people who are inside the school bus sector. It can create and stabilize the power grid. And most importantly, we received a question earlier on whether or not it could serve as an emergency shelter. Lion's actually doing that in Prince Edward Island right now, where we're using our buses to back up community centers in the event of an outage or in the event of critical asset failures on other portions of the island. This all generates revenue and solves the aforementioned problems that we were talking about. All right, so what is vehicle-to-grid? Because this is the biggest component of school buses today and where I think this is all going to go. Vehicle-to-grid is just bidirectional charging. When you plug the bus in, it can exchange power with the grid. It can power up a building, or you can send that power directly back to the grid if you have a program with your local utility. In Ontario, since this discussion is Ontario-centric, has allowed this to occur. There's been 2 policy changes made by the Ontario government in the last couple of months that would allow you to take part in what's known as the Industrial Conservation Initiative, which funds Class A global adjustment, which is fancy utility speak for changing to coincident peaks on your bill. What this means is school bus companies are not just selling their services to school districts. They can now partner with the large real estate income trusts, the Cadillac Fairviews and the Morguards of the world, or the large industrial users like the Maple Leaf Foods or the whatever else is going on in Ontario today. These are new commercial revenue opportunities that can stabilize the grid, lower demand, and in Ontario's case, stop the sale of electricity at a loss overnight by storing that energy inside large batteries and then distributing it out during peak hours. Ontario has about 5 coincident large peaks a year. 2 are in winter. They usually occur on weekends as home heating load rises up, and the rest occur in summer when school buses are parked. This is a perfect revenue opportunity for school buses, and the revenue makes sense today. This means that owners will be compensated from multiple revenue sources. This means that the electric school bus economy is going to start to diversify in terms of revenue sources. We can capitalize these school buses based on vehicle-to-grid revenue today. These health benefits are actualizable today, which is why I would love to sit down with the academics in the room afterwards and talk about what total cost of ownership actually means. Where's this funding going to come from, and where's this money going to come from? Well, it's on the table today. These revenue sources are here today. And I don't want to put Ontario under the fire or anything, but there's more than 1,000 school buses operating, 1,000 electric school buses operating in the province right next door. Quebec's been doing this for a while. We have this figured out, and we'd love to share that data with you. This is something you guys could operate on today. And this all comes back to the infrastructure solution that you're going to put in place. This infrastructure is going to last several generations of school buses. We've all standardized onto medium and heavy duty school bus systems. It operates on the SAE combo J1772 or CCS1 combo, which is a wild acronym that just means we all use the same thing. And we can remove all that complexity by using software to control all this. We know fleet operators today that can send power back to the grid, including the Cajon Valley School District that Sue mentioned, which is using Lion buses. National Express, the New York vehicle-to-grid model, is also using Lion buses. Prince Edward Island is using Lion buses today to do vehicle-to-grid, as is British Columbia, BC Hydro, and CTC Experiences. So is Florida Power and Light, and I forget the name of the school bus company in Miami. No one knows? Okay, cool. There's some other Lion folks here as well. The infrastructure solutions will permit you to do all of this, and this is an asset that you are going to own for many years. It's something that you can take with you. We can design it to be permanent. We can design it to be mobile. But at the end of the day, this is something that you're capitalizing that will permit you to open up new revenue streams. Your infrastructure component is not a capital burden to you. It's an asset to open up new revenue streams. This is what we've seen across the school bus sector and across the industry in Canada and in the United States. And by partnering with third parties as well that have an interest in monetizing carbon credits, since you will be driving zero-emission vehicles and you can use and generate renewable energy certificates. Ontario is a great example for this. Somebody mentioned that we have 28 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That's the average, and it's not necessarily accurate. Overnight, Ontario is between 1.7 and 4 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And during peak hours, I spent 7 years with Hydro Ottawa, and before that I was with Brookfield Renewable, and I just want to make sure these numbers hold still. After coal closed down in Ontario, peak hours were between 127 and 154 grams of CO2. Perfect. Let's assume we're 154 and you powered up overnight and you displace with a fleet of 50 school buses 12 meg. You just got compensated at around $200 per kilowatt hour of renewable energy certificates over that carbon market. There's another revenue source for you, and you're actively cleaning up the grid while generating nothing. You're simply load balancing. That revenue is going to clean up our grid and answer everybody's question in this room about whether or not electric school buses are going to eventually contribute to climate change. They won't. We're actually going to go the other way. We're going to help clean up the grid as your infrastructure solutions are modified and partnered up with people inside the space who are doing carbon trading, energy load shedding, and partnering up with utilities and the IESO who are taking part in these load balancing initiatives. So I'm sorry if I'm rushing through this. I only have 7 minutes. I will finish with 2 things here. The first is that these vehicles, especially from Lion, are built in Canada. We talk a lot about using the electric heat systems on board vehicles. Lion does do that, but we have vehicles as far north as Fairmont, Quebec. That's further north than Ontario ends, by the way. Just keep going, you'll hit where we are. And we've tested our vehicles down to negative 62 degrees centigrade. A diesel won't turn on, neither will an internal combustion engine with gasoline, but the electric will. The problem is if you want to go more than 5 kilometers on that electric heat system, you're going to have to supplement with diesel. So we do. We use a Spheros heating system, and the diesel particulate matter is pushed out the back of the bus, which unfortunately does give us some emissions, but our internal greenhouse gas emissions calculations show us to be 96.8% cleaner than a traditional gasoline or diesel vehicle in the Quebec grid, which again is 100% hydro. Sorry, 99.7% hydro. And on the economic side of this, we're a Canadian company as well, guys. Like, we have 1,500 employees. We have a battery factory that does 5 gigawatt hours of batteries a year in Canada. We're developing these skills here today for your environmental engineering graduates, who I'd love to hire, by the way, to join this new company. We can do this today with our existing technology. And I'll finish up by just saying that electric school buses can be tailored to fit any fleet. A school bus alone can be utilized in multiple different capacities. This is a fantastic photograph. Does anyone know where this is? Mark, really? This is Saint-Jérôme, Quebec, where the headquarters of Lion Electric is. That is a Lion Electric school bus that is operated by a private fleet that is on lease by the municipality. So Saint-Jérôme's about 150,000 people in the Montreal area. It does not have its own transit fleet. It's part of the EXO network. Picture Metrolinx, but good. And sorry, that got way more laughter than I thought it would. Anyway, because the city has a university, a cégep, which is like our version of a college, library, and large athletic facility, the city took it upon itself to actually put together a free system of public transit to supplement its own public transit fleet from the EXO network. This is free. You can take that bus for free. And when I talked to the city, I asked them about 7 weeks ago whether or not people were actually taking it. It's done over 95,000 people since it began at the beginning of this year, almost all of them university students that would otherwise be parking in a commuter-centric university and college. That's an insane greenhouse gas reduction, and it provides a tertiary revenue source to school bus operators that would otherwise only be using those buses to transport kids. It's Autobus Campo, by the way, that put that together. This can be utilized across multiple fleets inside the school bus operators today, and school districts can play a role in supplementing all that income by partnering with them and generating leads and revenue for them, as well as partnering with schools, industrial conservation initiative, bringing down demand and responding to peaks. There's revenue sharing opportunities for everybody involved here that will bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And if you want an example of what to do, just look next door. That's basically it. I guarantee you I'm over time, but thank you so much.
So we're going to be taking questions at the end of all the panel presentations. Thank you. So my next speaker is Adam Thorne. Adam is the director of Pembina Institute's transportation program. He's based in Toronto, and his work focuses on policies that support the decarbonization of Canada's transportation sector, especially on-road transportation.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Hopefully I can project. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm going to go very quickly because I do want to fit under my 7 minutes as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to sort of lead us down a pathway to talk about ESVs. I promise I'm going to get there, but I want to begin with a broader discussion about medium and heavy duty vehicles generally. So we know, so first of all, I should say, The Pembina Institute. For those of you who don't know, we are a clean energy think tank. We're helping to advance Canada's clean energy transition. We work across the energy sector. So I want to talk a little bit about medium and heavy duty vehicles. Right now, we know, or at least I think we're beginning to win when it comes to light duty vehicles. We're seeing emissions drop from light duty vehicles. When the government finalizes our LDV mandate, which should be, I hope, any day, we're going to see those fall even further. When it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles, on the other hand, this is a tougher category. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to, or at least how we are advocating we can begin to solve this problem. And again, I promise I will get to ESBs in just a moment. So in order to deal with Canada's greenhouse gas emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles, Canada committed to a significant and ambitious set of targets in the ERP, that is the Emissions Reduction Plan of 2022. And so they committed to 35% of all new sales being zero emission vehicles by 2030 and 100% where feasible by 2040. This is a significant commitment to reduce emissions across the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector. What we recognized was that at the time, at least, Canada really didn't have a clear plan, or at least a comprehensive plan to meet that. So we came up with a report, a series of reports, that proposes a strategy. These reports have 20 recommendations across infrastructure, capacity building, but I think the central recommendation and the foundational recommendation that I'm going to talk about for just a moment, and then I'll move into electric school buses and why this is all relevant to that discussion, focuses on a medium and heavy duty vehicle sales mandate. So very much like a mandate that has been proposed for the light duty vehicle sector that would help reduce emissions from the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector. And so what we did to support this report and engage in research around this was modeling, to look at exactly what the impacts would be of different policy scenarios on emissions from or sales from of medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so you can see the baseline. This is essentially Canada's set of policies right now. This is our carbon tax, this is the CFR, this is the current set of purchase incentives for those types of vehicles, as well as infrastructure funding. You can see that with the baseline, we come nowhere near the 2030 or the 2040 targets. We also wanted to model whether or not subsidies would be, that is purchase incentives, would help move the needle. Now, this is not to say that purchase incentives are not important. They are incredibly important. We know that they are really important to changing that total cost of ownership calculation that's going to be so necessary for the uptake of these vehicles. But on its own, it's not simply those types of policies. We modeled up to $20 billion of subsidies in Canada, which I don't think the government of Canada is currently considering or likely to consider. It still doesn't get us very close to that 2030 or 2040 targets. According to our analysis and our modeling, it is only a sales standard that is going to help us get very close to that 2030 and that 2040 target. We've talked about, or some of the previous presentations have really sort of talked about some of this already. I think some of us are sold on this, so I'll just focus on the first one. That is, what are the benefits here from a sales mandate? One is, of course, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Our estimates suggest it could decline from 35 megatons in 2020 to 10 or less by 2050. If Canada is going to have any hope of meeting its 2050 net zero target, it has to implement a policy that is going to significantly reduce emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles. One of the challenges, I think, with medium and heavy duty vehicles is, of course, it's not a single sector. It's not like the light duty vehicle sector where most of those vehicles kind of do the same thing. It's lots of different vehicles doing lots of different things, and we need to understand that. And so our proposed mandate is really based on what we call a phased-in approach. This is adapted from CalStart's beachhead strategy, but it's really applied to the Canadian context. And so it breaks this sector down into sort of its component parts. And again, we're getting close to why this matters for electric school buses. So what we're proposing is a phased-in approach that really focuses on those areas of kind of low-hanging fruit. Which vehicles are ready to electrify today, right? Which vehicles will suit the characteristics of electrification, have short and relatively predictable routes, return to barn at the end of the day. Of course, buses fit that characterization really well. So do medium-duty vehicles, or at least some medium-duty vehicles. Here we're thinking of those sort of ubiquitous urban delivery vehicles that we see every day. Again, those relatively short routes, relatively predictable routes, and they tend to return to the barn at the end. Because of this, we are recommending really aggressive sales targets when it comes to these vehicle categories. So we are recommending that the government require that 100% of new sales of these vehicles by 2030. Again, a fairly aggressive target, but we think it's doable because of these vehicles and the way that they tend to be operated. When it comes to medium-duty vehicles, as we move up those weight classes, you can see the delay in terms of the full 100% requirement for those vehicles. It is when we move into the heavy-duty vehicle category, of course, that we run into the most technically difficult vehicles to transition. Long-haul Class 8 vehicles, we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like, what the technologies are going to be available for that, whether it's going to be hydrogen or battery electric. So what we're doing here is buying time by being aggressive in these lighter categories that are ready to electrify now, that there are lots of vehicles available on the road today, in order to buy time for those learnings, that innovation, that technology development to move up or to trickle up to those heavier vehicles. And so this is why I think this is so important in terms of a discussion about electric school buses. Electric school buses really, I think, become a pilot project when it comes to the actual ability to transition the entire medium and heavy-duty vehicle sector. And so in my remaining time, I'd like to talk a little bit about a study that we released in August around electric school buses in Canada, or in Ontario, excuse me. We decided to take a slightly different perspective with this report. We think, again, I think we've heard very convincingly, or at least I'm convinced, that the health benefits and the climate benefits of the transition to electric school buses are real. So I won't even talk about these. I think our previous speakers did a much better job than I can about convincing you of the health benefits. But I want to talk a little bit about the economic benefits of this. We know that the medium and heavy-duty vehicle sector in Canada generally has had a really tough time over the last 20 years. It is functioning at about 10% of its pre-2008 production levels. Right? This is, of course, representative of the broader manufacturing sector in Canada and the difficulty it's had. Of course, this often falls most severely on small and medium enterprises, which will be, of course, important in a moment. So what we wanted to do is make an economic case for the adoption of school buses or electric school buses in the province of Ontario. We wanted to say to a government that perhaps isn't as convinced about the health and the environmental benefits as perhaps some of us in this room are, that there are real benefits to Ontario's economy from these vehicles. And so we looked at what if Ontario adopted Quebec's targets of 65% by 2030? What if we were aggressive, ambitious in Ontario? What would that do for Ontario's economy? We estimated that it would create 13,000 jobs and $1.5 billion in GDP by 2030. Right? This is jobs in manufacturing, so these are good jobs. These are jobs that tend to be relatively high paying and don't require necessarily higher education degrees. Right? This is a way of rebuilding manufacturing in Ontario with a new, clean economy that can benefit all Ontarians. And in particular, we looked at, and this is in conjunction with Green Economies Canada, looked at the impact on SMEs, the supply chain. We know in Canada, OEMs, the domestic OEMs, have a really dominant share when it comes to ESBs. And so, for example, New Flyer, Green Power, and of course Lion Electric have the lion's share, pardon the pun, of those sales. And so what we're looking at here is a real opportunity to build this supply chain in Ontario and in Canada. Again, I don't think I'll talk too much about these. I think some of our previous speakers spoke to these, I think, in a better way, both in terms of vehicle to grid, the reduced operating costs. All of those different benefits are real. They're becoming more real. This technology is developing every day. We're seeing this change daily. So our recommendations to the federal, or to the provincial government, excuse me, are really about accelerating the adoption of these vehicles. Accelerating the adoption of these vehicles is going to lead to, of course, health and environmental benefits, which certainly I'm convinced of, but they're also going to contribute to significant economic benefits, to jobs being created in Ontario, and good jobs at that. So I think I'm still within my 7 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Adam. So next up is Cedric Smith. Cedric is also Director of Transportation in another prominent NGO, Pollution Probe, a leading Canadian environmental nonprofit, and he leads research and stakeholder engagement in areas including electric vehicles, rail, light and heavy-duty vehicle decarbonization.
Thanks so much, Marianne, and thanks to everybody and to UFT for having me here today. About 10 years ago, I spent a very stressful year getting my MA at UFT, and it's good to be back. So here we are talking again about electrifying Ontario's school bus fleet, but we're actually going to be talking mostly about another city in Canada, a colder city, a more northern city, Calgary. And how does Calgary relate to Ontario, and what lessons can we learn from Calgary within the Ontario context? I'm going to be trying to make that connection for you guys in this presentation and try to tie this all together for you. So first I want to talk about Pollution Probe's electric school bus strategy, which we released a couple months ago in October 2023. The electric school bus strategy from Pollution Probe did a lot of different things. It first spelled out a lot of the different benefits of electrifying Ontario's school bus fleet. We have about 20,000 school buses within the province. And I won't get into them in too much detail here because you've had a lot of great speakers who've already got into them, and you're going to have a lot of great speakers after me who are also going to get into them. But just at a very high level, one of the real great benefits of electrifying school buses in Ontario is combating climate change. We're seeing that an electric school bus emits about 4 times more CO2 per kilometer than conventional passenger vehicles. And if you look at that, graph to the right, you can see that if you have 75% electrification by 2042, you're going to get about a cumulative GHG reduction of about 1.4 megatons. So that's quite significant within this province. The second one is protecting human health. We've heard a lot of great stuff from south of the border about some of these randomized control studies about how can electrifying school buses protect human health, specifically children's health, both the people who are on the bus and the people who are around the bus. It's really beneficial for them. We're going to hear a lot more detail about actually our study by another speaker later on today. So again, I won't get too deep in there. And then Adam just gave a really great overview of the economic development opportunities that come with electrifying school buses. But maybe just to add a bit more onto that, we're seeing Ontario's abundance of several key battery minerals. A lot of them have very long and complicated names. Can't quite remember them off the top of my head, but if you look them up, there are a lot of syllables in them, and they're difficult to pronounce properly. Ontario also has the second largest vehicle producing region in North America by volume. If you look at this to the right, we have a little flow chart that shows sort of some of the different economic benefits and sectors within the Ontario economy that are relevant to these benefits of electrification. So another aspect of our electric school bus strategy is we put together what's called a matrix of actions. And what is a matrix of actions? These are sort of detailed actions that different stakeholders within Ontario can take to accelerate the electrification of school buses in the province. And not only did we give the actions that they can take, we also gave sort of what are the stakeholders and who are the people that are required for these actions. It's not just the provincial government, it's also the utilities, it's also the nonprofit sector, a lot of different groups that have a lot of important roles to play when it comes to this task that we have in front of us. And we split that up into 4 different areas. The first was pilot and demonstration projects, the second was policy development, the third was funding commitments, and then the last was supportive resources. And what I'm really going to focus on in this presentation, and this is how we connect Calgary to Ontario. This is how we connect those 2 provinces and how we make that link, is we recommended pilots and demonstrations be put into place because, again, this is a newer technology. Again, this is sort of a more emerging market. There are not that many electric school buses on the road, and a lot of these fleet operators, they don't really know entirely what they're getting into, and it's a bit of a sort of a fog of war that's in front of them. They don't know everything that's related to this, and a lot of times when there is that fog of war in front of you, when you don't know really what's going on, you kind of want to just settle back into sort of what you're used to and avoid the whole thing altogether, which is totally understandable. And so that's why we need more of this data out there so that these fleet operators who are thinking potentially about converting to electric school buses, they've heard that there are that there are these benefits, these financial benefits to electrifying, that they have more of that information and they feel more confident in terms of their decision going forward. And so that's why one of our key recommendations in our matrix of actions for Ontario was to provide funding for the demonstration of electric school buses. And that's how we get into Calgary. So about a year ago, Pollution Probe teamed up with a couple partners. The first was Mobility Futures Lab, another one was RFS Energy, and the third was Southland Transportation. And we were actually able to get a school bus, an electric school bus, within the context of Calgary, Alberta, and test it out a little bit and really find out sort of some of these energy consumption data and use that energy consumption data to then also build a total cost of ownership sort of estimate for this bus within the Calgary context. And why is this important? Why is the Calgary context important? And why is the Canadian context important in general? There's two main reasons for it. Generally, when you look into the past, a lot of these electric school bus trials and a lot of these pilots that have been done, the data isn't shared publicly. These are sort of run by corporations who use them for their own internal purposes. They don't really have any benefit or any motivation to share the data publicly. And so the fleet operators who are, again, facing that fog of war, they're not sure what's in front of them, they're not sure what's going to happen, they're not actually benefiting from this data. So we wanted to put together a project where we're actually sharing the data broadly across Canada so that people can actually benefit from this. And the second reason why it's very important is, again, Calgary, if you go outside, especially later on in the year, you might need 3 layers of clothing. It's very cold, right? And if you look at where have all these pilots been done in the past, it's south of the border where it's a bit warmer. I've gone to Washington in the summer. It's actually quite hot down there. So it's a very different context, and those findings and those hotter weather doesn't always translate well to the Canadian context. Now, is Ontario as cold as it is in Calgary? Not quite, but again, Ontario and Calgary might be more similar than Ontario and somewhere south of the border. So what were the objectives of this Calgary pilot project? So we ran a bus with Southland Transportation for the course of a year from September 22 to June 23. And again, the objectives were to present that real-world operational data and make it public. Also to use that operational data to assess the business case of an electric school bus. So does it actually save money for operators in Calgary to run an electric school bus relative to a diesel school bus? And then we also wanted to provide school bus fleet operators with some of those challenges and some of those opportunities related to deploying electric school buses. So some of the technical specifications here, I won't get into it into too much detail, but we used a level 2 charging station, which we installed in the yard. We used remote monitoring software. We used telematics devices to monitor the consumption of the electric school bus of the energy over time. And we also set up regular checkup calls with us and the Southland staff. Here's a graph that shows some of the routes we evaluated in Calgary. You'll see some of those squiggly lines on the right can give you some idea. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Calgary topography. I'm not that familiar with it, but looks good. So just going to skip right over to the key findings from this report. If you're interested in learning more, sort of going more into depth about what we found and sort of how we came to these conclusions, please just give me a call or send me an email after this presentation, and I'm happy to go more into depth in it. But again, this is just a 5-minute presentation, so just going to give some of the key findings of this. So the first one was the range of an electric school bus in a single charge varied from 73 kilometers to 213 kilometers, depending a lot on the different operating conditions, but again, really depending mainly on the temperature. And why is this significant? It's because when electric school bus manufacturers sort of put out their data on how far these buses can go, they're more likely to be towards the upper end of that range than towards the lower end of that range. And it's important that these operators who are in colder conditions have a better idea of sort of how far these buses are going in conditions that are relevant to them. So then the second key finding was when we took that energy consumption data and when we built a total cost of ownership estimate on the basis of that, we saw that an electric school bus has about a 20% higher total cost of ownership than a diesel school bus. But when you take into account the federal financial incentives, the ZETA funding, that becomes 20% lower. So again, those purchase incentives super important in terms of making that case for cleaner zero-emission vehicles. We found, again, sort of zooming in onto the effect of the winter, we found that the use of the bus electrical heating system will actually decrease the the vehicle range of the electric school bus, or sort of conversely increase the energy intensity of the electric school bus by about 33%. What is an energy intensity? That's, again, it's a measure of how efficient these buses are. It's a measure of how much energy it takes to go a certain distance. So the greater the energy intensity, the lower the range of the bus. So again, winter conditions, the bus goes about 33% less distance. We've heard a lot here about diesel heaters. And so another key finding of our study was that the use of a diesel heater can actually extend the range of that electric school bus. I'm not going to go into every key finding here. So again, if you want to go into all the key findings that we found, please reach out after my presentation. Then we also found, again, financing programs are really essential in the initial stages of the electric school bus transition. Just because, again, it's an immature market, there are not too many of these vehicles on the road. You can't always be sure that an electric school bus itself is adequate collateral for a loan, because you can't be sure if you can actually sell the bus if you want to. As a result, interest rates are quite a bit higher, so financing programs are quite essential here. And then we found that there are still regulatory and technological barriers to potential revenue sources, such as vehicle-to-grid. And these barriers, again, given how important vehicle-to-grid technologies are, we've heard from our friend at Lion Electric, it's really important that these barriers be studied, especially within the Alberta context, to make sure that that can get going. And then our final key finding, maybe more of a recommendation, is that operators take advantage of the limited infrastructure cost requirements of small deployments and existing federal financial support to sort of start training their staff on this technology, sort of in the anticipation of it becoming more ubiquitous over time. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We have two more speakers, really covering the broad range of institutions and organizations exploring that space. So changing pace now from the nonprofit sector, we're going to hear from Kevin Hodgkinson, who's the general manager at the Toronto Student Transportation Group. Kevin is responsible for managing the transportation services of over 40,000 students for Toronto's two largest school boards, Toronto District School Board and the Toronto Catholic School Board. 7 different school bus operators are contracted to provide service on over about 1,800 school buses, minivans, and accessible vehicles.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm just recovering from the flu, so if I start talking nonsense, I'm blaming it on the flu, okay? Thanks for the introduction. So basically, yeah, again, school boards. I think we saw on the slide before, 72 school boards in Ontario, 34 transportation consortiums, and you might wonder what these transportation consortiums are. They are the English Catholic, English Public, French Catholic, French Public, that are all working together to make efficiencies in student transportation. Ministry of Education mandated these consortiums in mid-2000s, and again, it's going to the point of reducing the number of buses on the road as one of our goals to, again, decrease our reliance on fuels like that. So the school boards, beyond school busing, obviously they have a number of issues around, you'll see the solar panels on the roofs of schools, other items like that they're already starting to investigate in terms of how to green the technologies at the school boards and the school board fleet. The school bus fleet, as I said, is really an emerging technology. We have 2 buses, or we had 2 buses in the city of Toronto that we were using for school bus operations, and we're looking to expand that going forward. As you heard earlier, what you might not know is that 99% of all of our school board consortium contracts are contracted out to third parties in Ontario here. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later, again, is electric charging stations might be the key component to actually electrification of buses here, at least in the city of Toronto. So funding, we talked about how school boards get their money and how transportation gets their money. We receive a transportation grant from the Ministry of Education each year for student transportation. New this year is a funding formula based on a set of criteria and a number of items included in terms of delivering that service. You'll see that on the slide on the right-hand side. You see the top two are capital and operating. So there's two items that we're talking about in terms of electric buses. Capital being the one, obviously we've heard that electric buses are considerably higher than the actual cost of gas and diesel, and operating. And again, this should be lower than what it is possibly for our gas and diesel buses. So you talk to school boards would say, hey, we don't have enough money for our services. That's pretty standard out there. Ministry, I think they would say that based on the evidence, they're trying to distribute the funds as equitably as possible to all of our school bus or to school boards out there. So the question in terms of the funding we go to the ministry is, do we need a variable rate? Do we need a rate that I say, electric buses and diesel buses? Maybe there's some difference there in terms of having to cost that out in terms of the funding that we get from the Ministry of Education. So in terms of how we start and how we award those contracts, that would be the first question we go forward. So I said every school board consortium enters into contracts with our third-party contractors. We do generally go out to the marketplace every 5 to 10 years with these requests for proposals or tenders to secure new contracts with the school bus operators. And the school boards consortium will define what they want in those procurement bids. And again, in our last contract, we did actually ask for prices on electric school buses. And that ended up being approximately 20 to 60% higher than what our rates were for gas or diesel. So for us, it was a hard ton in terms of costing. But we also talked about what we have in those contracts. And I think Sarah had mentioned before about the lifespan of buses and whatnot. And certainly when Sick Kids came out with their report a decade ago regarding air quality on school buses, we created a green plan, green school bus plan, which in case we had a lot of you shall have on the bus and a lot of you should consider on the bus. And these are all items around trying to reduce the environmental impact of those buses going forward. So school boards and consortia have the ability to basically select those things in the contract that they want, knowing full well that those should-haves will obviously cost money going forward to the bid. So electrification. I think we've heard before the Ministry of Education conducted a pilot study in 2017. They dished out about 12 to 18 electric school buses throughout the province. Toronto, as we had 2 school buses to come here to the city of Toronto. But what are some of the things that we noticed in terms of that? First and foremost is cost. Also, we said that those bids that we saw our last bid were considerably higher than what they are for gas and diesel. Range anxiety is what we heard a lot of times in terms of that. I know one of the partners that had the school bus, they said, okay, put the bus up in the 400, run it up to Barrie, bring it back, and when it runs out of energy, we know we've tested how far it can go. So, good things like that in terms of trying to figure out what those obstacles or what those distances are, help in terms of that. And third part is, again, infrastructure accessibility. And significantly, we've heard about where buses park. In Toronto, over 60% of our buses are parkouts. They don't return to the depot at the end of the day. Over 1,000 of our 1,800 plus buses park at our schools at the end of the day. So in terms of how we move forward, the school boards will have to be part of the solution for electrification here in the city, in the province of Ontario. Specifically in Toronto, I'm sure it's the same in other areas, and certainly rural areas will have other issues as well, but certainly in the city of Toronto, that's one of the issues that we need to face and look at going forward to make this work for us going forward. So finally, just the Toronto experience. In our last contract, we did award buses, the electrification of buses on the Toronto Island. So I don't know if you know, we have a school on Toronto Island. Surprisingly, 200 kids from the mainland come over on the ferry each day. About 10 to 15 kids on the island go to the school. So we need to pick up those kids on the ferry docks, bring them to the school so they can get their education that day. The school is also an education center, though, outdoor education center. So a number of school kids come throughout the day to the school to learn about their environmental education curriculum and whatnot. So those buses are used to ferry those students back and forth to the dock and the ferry each day as well. Certainly one of the items around that, right now we're using gas diesel buses. They have to ferry those buses back and forth each day off the island, not every day, but back and forth off the island because they can't fuel on the island. We're not allowed to fuel there. And secondly, since the island school is an outdoor education center focused on environmental incentives, we want to make sure that we kind of have that connection with that curriculum around energy, or not energy efficiency, but around environmental protection of and that. So we also, in that contract, we were approved for 2% of the school bus fleet to run electric buses. I underline consideration because we weren't given the authority to actually go out and make that 2%. That 2% would have equated to about 40 to 50 buses, additional buses in the city of Toronto running electric buses. At this point in time, we're still a work in progress to see if the funding becomes available to move that forward in the city of Toronto. Our last contract, obviously, was we wanted to have that 2% in there to set the base, to set the thing going forward, so that all of our operators would learn what those pros and cons were in regards to the trials and errors around electric school buses. You know, we've heard about the range issues. You know, where are you getting the parts from? Do your mechanics know how to deal with electric buses? All those items, they have this contract time in order to get ready for the next contract, which we said is anywhere from 6 to 10 years out, allowing them hopefully at that point in time to have some more cost parity in terms of electric diesels. So at that point in time, we can make a more further entry into the electric marketplace at that point in time. And finally, yes, our first electric school bus complaint. I just like to leave this one to last. It's a little parody of what we have, and I've told some of you all this already and everything. So our first electric school bus complaint was a noise complaint. And you're going to say, what do you mean a noise complaint? Electric buses are all quiet. But what you may not know is that when the buses drop to a certain threshold in speed, sound comes on to alert the people that the bus is coming to a stop or kind of slowing down. We had an individual on one of our routes. He works nights. He wakes up in the morning, and I don't know if the music can change on these buses, but this one sounded like an ice cream truck. So at 7:30 in the morning, you hear this ice cream truck coming down the road and whatnot, and he's waking up, looks to see this big yellow school bus coming out the window, gets the complaint, says, no, that's too much noise. I don't know how much more noise than a diesel bus it makes, but it did apparently. So the solution to that was, I believe, we lowered the threshold to when the bus, the music came on, and lowered the volume to the bus as well. So I wanted to leave you with that note, just as a really oddity around electrification of the school bus fleet. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And our very last, but certainly not least, speaker of the day is Helen Doyle. Helen has over 30 years of experience in environmental public health. She currently chairs the Ontario Public Health Association's Environmental Health Work Group, collaborating with public health partners to promote and advocate for action on climate change, air quality, water quality, housing, built the natural environment. And she's also representing OPHA on the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, supporting advocacy and awareness to promote healthy environment for children. Thank you.
So I just press the
just this
on
one.
button.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks everybody else. I'll try and talk as fast as the previous speakers, if I can. So I'm representing the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, and I'm also a volunteer with the Ontario Public Health Association. So KIPCHI is the acronym for it. So it's a national collaboration. It's an association of multiple sectors, and our aim is to advocate and increase awareness and advocate for action so that all children have access to healthy environments to live, learn, play, and grow. I was going to say work, but not yet. So these are as an example of some of the campaigns that KIPCHI has put on over the last few years. So we, through funding from Health Canada, have an annual Healthy Environments for Learning Day campaign, and our 2019 campaign was about diesel, obviously related to buses, and our most recent, 2023, was about electric school buses. And with this campaign for this year, we built on the work that we did with Pollution Probe that Cedric was talking about earlier. So we were asked to pull together the health evidence for that electric school bus strategy for Ontario, and I'll go through a bit of that. So talking about the benefits for children's health, for air quality, and climate change. So this is one of the images from our campaign poster from our electric school bus campaign, and what's in gray is what's in that report. So when we think about that iconic yellow school bus, it's to symbolize childhood education and community, yet it's also sources of emissions that are harmful to human health and climate change, and there are some of the examples of some of the pollutants that we heard about earlier. I like this image, and I looked at this study from Steiner et al. I think it was 2016 or 2018. The print is too small for me to read. I like the way they described how particulate matter in particular, how it's used. They described it as a Trojan horse because it's able to take very toxic substances and distribute them throughout the body. And that's, to me, that made better sense of why it can impact so many different parts of the body and have so many different impacts on health. And of course, we know that children are at greater risk, and I'll speak about that a little bit later, from diesel exhaust. And Health Canada has done a lot of studies in the most recent years that we've incorporated into this school bus strategy report. So children are at greater risk, and Sarah mentioned this already. Not only are they more susceptible because they're to the harmful impacts, because their bodies, brains, lungs are still developing, they also have greater exposure, spending more time outdoors, breathe more air per kilogram body weight, and also there's closer to the ground. So yesterday I went for a walk with my great niece in this picture here. Not here, there she's in Canmore, Alberta, but she was visiting. As we're walking down the street, even in a small town, we're walking next to a traffic corridor, so I'm thinking about the exposure that she's getting to traffic pollution. Also, it's an inequity issue. So children that are already experiencing inequities have greater, not only susceptibility, but greater exposure. So the health effects of diesel exhaust, Health Canada did a human health risk assessment of diesel exhaust in 2018 and looked at all of these different health effects of diesel exhaust. Some they have causation evidence, some it's strong evidence, but associations. Certainly the cancer one is very concerning, being a lung cancer linked to bladder cancer in adults, but also linked to childhood leukemia. And that was a recent study that Health Canada put out last year, stronger evidence about that. Immunological effects, reproductive and development effects, and some of the studies that we looked at recently about the impacts on brain function that are certainly very disturbing when you look at how that the diesel particulate matter and other toxins can impact the brain. More Health Canada studies, again, from the data from that there's earlier stats there are from Health Canada's 2016 Human Health Risk Assessment. The second set of data is from their 2022 traffic-related air pollution, which is diesel and gasoline. But when you compare these two, you can see that diesel emissions contribute by far the majority of the premature deaths from traffic pollution, acute respiratory symptom days when we're talking about child health, the asthma symptom days, childhood acute bronchitis episodes, so very significant. So I often hear, when I hear reports about our air quality, that it's getting better. I think they need to start with these stats so we see the impact on child health. It's also a child health and equity issue at home and at school. Health Canada released another study last year that looked at proximity to traffic pollution. Residential exposure, lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods are often located closer to high traffic corridors. And when they looked at all schools across Canada, almost 50% are within 200 meters of a high traffic corridor, so that's considered the traffic-related air pollution exposure zone, so they're getting elevated exposure to air pollutants. Health impacts of traffic noise. Sarah talked a little bit about this. We know that road traffic is the dominant source of noise in urban centers. Exposure to excessive noise, of course, quality of life and hearing loss, but other studies that link it to cardiovascular cognitive impacts, sleep disturbance, and particularly with children, we looked at a few studies that looked at the impact on hearing impairment, cognitive impairment, and negative impacts on behavior. We also didn't want to just talk about the air pollution benefits, but we also wanted to talk about why this is so important for climate change. Children's physical and mental health is affected by climate change, and diesel buses contribute to climate change. Health Canada, in their study, in the assessment they did of climate change impacts across Canada, this was, I think, released in 2022 as well, they did some estimates on what the impacts climate change is going to have to Canadians from air pollution alone. And they estimated that by 2050, 850 more deaths annually across Canada than we're already seeing. If we want to focus on child health, 670 more child acute bronchitis episodes every year from air pollution because of climate change. So children at greater risk, So we know they're more susceptible to air pollution, obviously, also more susceptible to extreme heat. We know there's going to be more extreme heat events. They're more sensitive because they have more difficulty regulating their body temperature, more susceptible to water and foodborne diseases because of their developing immune systems. Mental health, I think, is so important that we have to think about the mental health impacts of climate change. Children are more susceptible, stress, PTSD after disasters from displacement, climate anxiety, all the feelings that when they hear in the news about what's happening with climate change, and the inequities that they're already experiencing. Climate change is going to exacerbate those even more. So that's all the negative. I was supposed to be talking about the benefits. This is the other half of the poster on our electric school bus campaign. Health Canada released another report, or a tool actually, last year, that you're able to estimate the benefits per ton of emissions reduction. So if you look at PM 2.5 and NOx, and you reduce that by a certain amount, you're able to estimate the health benefits. So one of the things, when we talked about the total cost of electric vehicles, I think we really need to incorporate the health costs and the health benefits into that. And I think Sarah and Sue talked about that a little bit earlier. But when I took that tool, and I shared it with Environment Canada, and they said this was appropriate to be able to use this tool, we estimated that over 7 million in health benefits, if we were able to reduce PM 2.5 and NOx by the equivalent of all the school buses in Ontario, over 7 million in health benefits every year from that. So I think we need to promote that message. Health Canada also, in their climate change report, looked at one climate reduction scenario, so reducing greenhouse gases, and they estimated, but in that one scenario, we could avoid over 5,000 premature deaths annually. And when we look at child health, if we think about asthma symptom days, almost 1 million asthma symptom days from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and child acute bronchitis episodes, over 4,000. And I think the last speaker talked about this too, when I was interested in the Toronto Island, to show children that your school board is showing an example of climate-friendly behavior. The fact that the school board on the island, it's an environmentally fence-sensitive or friendly school, you want to be showing your children and your school boards and the parents in the community that you're invested in climate-friendly behavior, and you want children to feel that they're part of that solution. So let's hope through this lectures today that we can promote that message more. And that's, if you want more information, hopefully these slides will be available to everybody. Thank you. Can I stay up here?